University clinical trials at Johns Hopkins and NYU are reporting significant success in treating depression and addiction with psilocybin compounds. While these studies happen in modern medical facilities, they rely on a psychological cartography that predates clinical research by centuries. A safe and effective psychedelic experience is rarely the result of a random chemical reaction. It requires a rigid, highly structured architecture. This animated diagram maps the baseline of human consciousness using Sigmund Freud's structural model. Notice how the ego sits directly between the primitive drives of the id and the external world. It acts as a reality-testing mediator and a structural filter. It dictates our spatial boundaries and maintains our continuous narrative identity. This is the mechanism that defines where the individual ends and the world begins. Now, introduce a high-dose psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin into this established psychological system. To understand the resulting experience, we must understand the boundaries being dismantled, because the primary effect of these compounds is to temporarily dissolve the ego structure entirely. This is drug-induced ego death. It is the total collapse of the ego's structural boundaries under the influence of a psychedelic substance. This initiates a disruption of multisensory self-consciousness. The narrative identity fragments, and the perceived physical borders of the body become fluid. When this internal filtering system goes offline, the mind enters a state of profound psychological freefall. Without the ego to mediate reality, the mind is exposed to chaotic, unfiltered stimuli. For an unprepared subject, this raw exposure often triggers severe anxiety or panic. To prevent this freefall from becoming a traumatic crisis, a new external structural framework must be introduced to safely house the mind during the collapse. In the 1950s, researchers discovered that the drug dose alone is an insufficient predictor of the experience. They established a foundational equation. The psychedelic journey equals the chemical substance plus set plus setting. Set refers to the internal state, an individual's preparation, personality, and immediate mood. Setting dictates the external environment, physical safety, social dynamics, and the broader cultural context. Manipulating a single variable alters the trajectory of the trip. The same chemical dose can result in a terrifying ordeal in a chaotic environment, or a therapeutic breakthrough in a secure one. Formalizing set and setting shifted psychedelics from unpredictable chemical anomalies into programmable psychological events. In the early 1960s, psychologists Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert established the Harvard Psilocybin Project. At the time, Leary was a professional behavioral psychologist, operating well within secular academic standards. His team faced a clinical problem. Western psychology lacked a vocabulary or framework for navigating the total dissolution of the self. To solve this, they looked for a map that already documented the specific stages of ego collapse. They found it in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, an ancient guide for navigating the afterlife. Leary's team translated the spiritual concept of the bardo, the in-between state of the afterlife, into a secular psychological framework for the drug-induced experience. By equating physical dying with psychological ego death, they converted ancient eschatology into a modern clinical blueprint. In 1964, they published The Psychedelic Experience, a manual that laid out this three-stage architecture. This timeline maps 3 phases. Stage 1 is the onset, a deep valley of complete ego loss. Stage 2 is the peak, a long, fragmented period projecting hallucinatory realities. Stage 3 is the come-down, the gradual return to reality and reconstruction of the narrative self. Having to snap was only half of the solution. The architecture required a human guide to act as a navigator. The guide read the manual aloud during the session, using it as a flight manual to bypass paranoia and anchor the subject. The combination of set, setting, the 3-stage bardo map, and a trained guide formed a complete defensive structure to manage the ego's collapse. This clinical framework did not stay confined to Harvard laboratories. it rapidly moved into the broader culture. In 1966, John Lennon discovered Leary's manual and followed its instructions for an early LSD experience. Lennon directly adapted the manual's language, including the instruction to turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream, into the lyrics for Tomorrow Never Knows. This broadcast the concept of ego death and Eastern spiritual frameworks to millions of listeners simultaneously. By translating these esoteric stages into popular lyrics, Leary's manual provided a specific framework for the 1960s emerging interest in mind expansion. As psychedelics re-enter legitimate medical research, the cultural associations of the 1960s are being stripped away. Despite the sterile environment, modern clinical trials continue to depend on this original architecture: optimized set and setting, highly trained facilitators, and structured mapping. The current objective of this therapy is integration, the process of taking insights from ego dissolution and applying them to everyday life. Psychedelic architecture aims to ensure a safe return to reality, where temporary altered states can be converted into permanent, positive altered traits.